Is China an evil totalitarian dictatorship where all of its 1.4 billion people are helpless prisoners of the evil CCP? This narrative that is repeated daily by mainstream media seems a bit strange to me, since every year 100 million or so Chinese leave China to travel the world, and then they all willingly just return home. How strange. Even more odd is the fact that when looking at Chinese history, it was the Chinese people themselves who overthrew their last emperor, ending the Qing dynasty. And again, it was the majority of Chinese people who decided to follow Communist Mao Zedong to completely run out the Chinese nationalists, chasing them all the way to the Chinese island of Taiwan, where they remain today. The Civil War never being completed because of the US Navy sitting in the Taiwan Strait in order to defend one of its puppet states. So is China really an authoritarian dystopia? Well, Biden's Summit for Democracy seems to say that. The USA is hosting its second ever Democracy Summit right now as it brings together 130 countries to speak on one of the most important topics for humanity, democracy. Of course, all people want to be free, masters of their own destiny, and no one wants to be a slave, especially in the modern era. In fact, I believe it would be accurate to say that most people were slaves just a few hundred years ago. Those of us who read history know that the African slave trade was vast and famous, but not everyone has read that a huge slave trade also occurred right across Eurasia, with the Vikings being some of the most prolific slave traders on Earth, raking in billions in today's dollars by doing so. But getting back to the US-created Democracy Summit, on the surface this looks like a great event, as it's multilateral, world-encompassing, and it promotes human freedom. But there are negatives, as it purposely excludes 63 nations because those nations are not quote-unquote democracies. Chinese media have accused the US of using the summit to create an ideological bloc, and therefore a massive division in our world. And it would seem that they are correct, as all the countries who don't agree with US foreign policy, such as Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, China, Russia, and North Korea, were not invited. And that is truly a big problem for us humans, living on this small watery green rock. We need more unity and less division in today's world. So why not invite these gigantic and important nations, which have a differing view of the world and possibly of democracy? Could it be that they were not invited because they oppose US hegemony and US policies of violence and regime change of sovereign states? Come to think of it, if this summit was truly about democracy, these so-called rival nations would have definitely been invited in order to ensure that a lively debate occurs, which is the bare minimum requirement for creating a free market of ideas, one of the pillars of Western democracy. Furthermore, the main purpose behind democracy is that all people are represented, but that ain't happening with this summit. By excluding China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and 1/3 of the world, the summit is silencing a large swath of humanity and labeling their nations as authoritarian without letting them speak for themselves. By dividing the world into democracies and authoritarian regimes, the summit is telling the world what to think, instead of engaging in debate and letting the world think for themselves. And this is exactly what their media does every single day. The West does a lot of telling and not a lot of listening or discussing. Now imagine if China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, etc. were invited. Could the world possibly learn something new? Could we possibly understand the other a little bit more? And is that such a bad thing to hear from people who we view as very different? Even more, if some nations are lagging behind in democratic processes, wouldn't it help to include everyone in the summit in order to encourage progress? No country is perfect, and for sure China and Russia and others can do better. Their inclusion in these summits could help them. Perhaps the biggest problem here is the narrow-mindedness that this type of thinking leads to. Yes, we all know that China doesn't have elections where one can vote directly for their leader, although they do have local village elections. But is it also possible that different types of democracy exist in our world? In other words, even without a direct vote for government top spots, could the Chinese government have their own way of choosing capable leaders, and thereby meeting the needs and desires of the majority of its people? These are important questions that aren't being discussed. Studies have actually shown that most Chinese people support their government, and therefore support their president/Communist Party chairman, Xi Jinping. Based on that evidence then, Xi's third term would, contrary to Western media reports, actually be democratic, as it reflects the will of the Chinese people. Moreover, if the majority of Chinese people are benefiting from CPC policies, and if the party listens to their grievances, then China would seem to have its own version of democracy that is definitely not Western. These are all interesting points that could have been discussed at Biden's summit if only he were open to discussion, which again is the main purpose of free speech and democracy. I'm not at all opposed to the Democracy Summit. Actually, I think it's a great thing, but I'm wary of it being used as a tool to divide the world. If all nation-states are already present in the United Nations, where they have a place to voice concerns and vote on the most pressing issues of the day, then I'm not sure what value is added by this summit. The United States itself isn't the best example of democracy, as a Princeton University study revealed that the laws passed in the US Congress don't even reflect what the majority of Americans want. Instead, they mostly reflect what the richest 10% want. As we all know too well, it doesn't matter if the US president is Democrat or Republican, we seem to always get the same old pro-war, pro-interference in other countries, and pro-corporate policies. So the real question is, why does the US get to decide who is truly democratic and who isn't?